So, socialism versus libertarianism, which system is best for maximizing freedom? Libertarianism is the only system for maximizing freedom. This begs the question, what exactly is freedom? Freedom is the ability to act on one's will without restraint or hindrance. Human action is intentional and shows an individual's moral preferences. When a man makes a choice and exercises their autonomy, they are proving via action that the action they choose fits their values and preferences. Inaction is also a choice. Thus, by action or inaction, we demonstrate what we prefer both morally and what we value. Restraints and hindrances to this action limit man's autonomy and ability to put forward their values and morals by definition. So in order to maximize freedom, the real question is, quote, which system limits restraints and hindrances on man's will? For sake of simplicity, I will divide these hindrances into two categories of conflict, man and nature. First conflict arises when one man stops another from enacting his will. When one man arbitrarily stops another from behaving as they choose, they are aggressing upon them by limiting their bodily autonomy. In doing so, they act and thus demonstrate via action that they do not value said bodily autonomy. Thus, they are stopped from arguing that they have a right to bodily autonomy and may be dealt with as a criminal until freedom of the victim is reestablished. This may sound confusing, but think of it this way. If a man chooses to mug you in an alley at gunpoint and states, your money or your life, he is proving via action that he does not value your life. We should be able to limit his freedom, lock him away until he learns his lesson or repairs the damage that he has done and apologizes. This principle further extends to your property. If we seek to maximize freedom and therefore limit restraints and hindrances on man's will, we must also protect his property. To refuse to do so would be to increase conflict between humans. Just as conflict arises when one man attempts to limit or restrain another man's bodily autonomy, so does conflict arise when one man attempts to control another man's property. Man establishes a historical link with property when he discovers and emborders property fit to his will. He acts with said property and thus intertwines his will, and thus his moral preferences and values with said property. When another man attempts to utilize this property without consent, they initiate conflict. They hinder the will of the first user. For example, John and Crusoe are alone on a deserted island. John happens upon a long and flexible sapling. He determines this would make an excellent fishing pole so that he can eat. He whittles the stick down and begins to look for leaves in the forest that he may turn into a fishing line. Crusoe is searching the forest for buoyant material to build a raft and happens upon what is now John's stick. He takes John's stick to create a raft. Crusoe has limited John's freedom and created conflict. John values eating more than escaping the island, and Crusoe is the opposite. But by stealing John's sapling, Crusoe has limited John's freedom. Consequences may be that they escape. John may fight Crusoe, or they may starve without fish to eat. The consequences do not matter to the question of whether Crusoe has limited John's freedom. He has stolen his property and thus enslaved John to his will. The second category of conflict that hinders man's will is nature. Nothing limits freedom more than your home being destroyed by a hurricane, your crops wilting, or being crippled by infirmity. Man's greatest battle is with nature. We are all born into this world with nothing, and it is imperative to our survival to subjugate nature to our benefit. Otherwise, we starve. Some would argue the lack of resources or unpredictable disasters demand enslavement for the greater good or the greater freedom. This is nonsense. You cannot reason with a hurricane. You cannot negotiate voluntary exchange with a hurricane. A hurricane's freedom cannot be trammeled, but man's freedom can. You cannot steal from a hurricane and give to the victims of nature. You can only steal from another man. The logic of socialism is that man does not have a right to his will or his body because the hurricane presents a greater threat to another man's will. This is also known as positive rights. This nonsensical position posits that we are more free if some people are enslaved to provide resources and opportunities to another. So how can you obtain more freedom with slavery? Simple. They claim that they can measure freedom. They believe they know the value of John's fishing pole sapling, and they can steal his pole to build a raft because they know better than John that the raft will lead them off of the island to a better utopia. And this is why we give socialist power, their people starve. It is clear that if you want to maximize freedom and therefore limit hindrances on man's will, that is, reduce conflict, that you must adopt a system of non-aggression better known as libertarianism.